Well, the U.S. isn't the only nation reaching out to Beijing. German leaders are rolling out the red carpet for Li Qiang, who's making his first foreign trip since becoming China's premier. Berlin put out its first ever national security strategy last week, and the document described China as both a partner and a systemic rival. As DW Chief International Editor Richard Walker reports, the two economic powerhouses seem as intertwined as ever.
A big day in Berlin. Olaf Scholz and a gaggle of his top ministers unveiling Germany's new national security strategy. Their message: the world is getting more dangerous, and Germany needs to respond.
For the first time in our country's history, we have drawn up a national security strategy.
Russia's invasion of Ukraine was a huge shock to the system for Germany. But there's another shock that's shaking the political class here in Berlin just as much. A shock that's not quite so sudden, but that's so big that it will soon get a strategy paper all of its own. This one is all about China. Xi Jinping has stuck by Vladimir Putin despite the war, a man he's called his best friend. If anything, they're getting closer. And this is driving home some hard realities about Xi's China. It's doubled down on authoritarian power, repressing freedoms in Hong Kong and minority rights in Xinjiang. It's threatening to attack Taiwan and asserting military dominance over the South China Sea. And dangerous near misses in the region are adding to fears of war between China and the United States, Germany's most important ally. Germany is not alone in worrying about all of this, but what makes it even harder is that Germany got in so deep with China. In the last decade and a half or so, the two sides built an incredibly close, almost symbiotic relationship. Now, the cracks are showing. China became Germany's top trading partner for years in a row, but the pandemic showed that supply chains could break down in a crisis. German car companies became addicted to China's exploding market. Now, Chinese rivals are threatening to beat them in electric cars. Chinese tech got stuck into sensitive German infrastructure. Now that's seen as a security risk. All of this presents Berlin with some really tough dilemmas about how to rethink the relationship with China. And inside the government here, there are differing views. Here's a case in point. China's state-owned shipping giant COSCO bought a stake in a terminal at Hamburg Harbor, Germany's most important port. Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock and Vice-Chancellor Robert Habeck were adamantly against, saying this would give China too much sway over critical infrastructure. But Olaf Scholz overruled them as Chancellor. The US is keen to rally its allies to a common approach to these sorts of decisions. And at the G7 summit this year, they all agreed they should de-risk their relations with Beijing. A step back from the decoupling the most hawkish voices were calling for. But what's a risk and what's not a risk? Well, that's open to interpretation.
The indications are that Olaf Scholz has a fairly narrow definition of what de-risking is. I think for him it's mainly about reducing dependencies, ensuring that supply chains are resilient. I think the message from the Chancellery so far has been that they don't want to rock the boat. I think Germany is going through some difficult economic times, and there isn't a great deal of appetite for confronting China.
Scholz tried to walk this line on his first trip to Beijing late last year, speaking out about tensions in the relationship while stressing the need to cooperate on global issues like climate change. And mingled among the diplomats, he brought a squad of German CEOs with him to talk business.
And for some analysis, we have our Chief International Editor Richard Walker joining us here, who filed that report. Good to see you, Richard. Now, it was suggested in your report that there's little appetite in Germany for confronting China right now. So what exactly do you expect from Chancellor Olaf Scholz's meeting with the Chinese Prime Minister today?
Yeah, so Li Qiang is in Berlin for what are called the German-Chinese government consultations. These were brought in 2011 under Angela Merkel during that period of the kind of creation of this sort of symbiotic relationship we just talked about in that report. And they was like the sort of political expression of this relationship. You had not just Merkel talking to her counterpart, you had both governments talking to each other across almost the entire levels of government. So very, very close relationship built up. And there have been several rounds of these now over the years. But this is the first round under this current government with Olaf Scholz as Chancellor, and the first time in person in many years because of the pandemic getting in the way. And Olaf Scholz is going to try to walk the line we just described at the end of the piece there. On the one hand, trying to sort of say, OK, we need to be talking, we need to be cooperative, but also reflecting the new realities that we talked about there, that we've heard about the strains in the US-China relationship and the strains coming from China's behaviour. And I think you can see this in what we're hearing from the German side is they really want to focus these consultations on talking about climate and saying that let's work together on climate. Try to keep it, OK, we can talk about this one thing, all the other problems still problems, but let's try and make progress on this.
That's the partner part of the relationship.
Yeah, that's the partner part of the relationship, the cooperative side of the relationship. But I think it's interesting that we're also hearing that there will not be a joint statement coming out at the end of these talks.
Right.
And if you think about previous rounds under Angela Merkel, I've got the joint statement that came out of the 2018 talks, the last ones that happened in person under Angela Merkel. They go to more than 20 pages. There are 71 separate points and a list of then 10 additional agreements in addition to that. German side saying that this time, basically, there was not even any point in talking about coming up with this because you just couldn't.
The fact that there is no point, that's the systemic rivalry part of it, I presume, of the relationship now. But this is Li's first overseas visit since taking office in March as China's #2 official. What does that say about the importance of Germany for China?
Yeah, I think it very much is a signal from the Chinese side that they see the relationship with Germany as important. They would like to get back to a sense of sort of business as usual. They would like to get the business working better again. They want to encourage German companies to keep investing in China to the extent that they did during that last decade and a half or so. They don't want this idea of de-risking that we heard about in that report to lead to a complete decoupling of the relationship, which is the risk that they see there. And there will be big business delegations from both sides, from the Chinese side and from the German side, engaging in these talks of the next couple of days, which, of course, potentially can conflict with the message from the German government, from Scholz and co., that it's not business as usual. So walking this line is going to be tricky.
How is Germany balancing its relationships with China on the one hand and the United States on the other, given the ongoing escalating tensions between these two countries?
Yeah, I mean, it really is tough. And of course, US, and we've been talking about it in the show here, US-China, the tensions between these two superpowers really are the framing geopolitical story of this era. There is a risk that they could go to war sometime. And Germany is in the very awkward position of having China as its biggest trading partner, but the United States as the guarantor of its security. And, I mean, the government, when you talk to them on background especially, they always make clear, well, of course, China, the United States comes before China. This is a much more important alliance. But they really don't want the world to drift into a sort of new Cold War situation where you have to pick between one side and the other. Germany really doesn't want to do that. And I think that one little interesting takeaway recently from an opinion poll just done recently by a think tank here in Germany, they found out that the majority of Europeans would want to stay neutral if there was ever a US-China war over Taiwan. And I think that points a little bit to the mood, not just in the government, but in the public, that they would really like the US and China to find a kind of way of getting along.
Richard, thank you very much. Our Chief International Editor, Richard Walker.